Today, I want to talk about fanaticism and the fanatical attitude. I have in my notes here, dated December 6th. This is the first time I talked to myself or wrote to myself about the plan of making this video. And so I'm going to do it finally. The impetus, the inspiration came when I was reading the lecture notes, Sam Rocha's lecture notes on his course, Philosophical Research in Education. Now I feel free to share that because the lecture notes are available on academia.edu. Eventually, these lecture notes are going to be edited and turned into a book, and it's going to be a great book when that happens. So the impetus was one of those lectures, lecture number 9. And in that lecture, throughout that course, he makes very useful distinctions. And one of them in lecture 9 is a distinction between three attitudes in reading, 3 different attitudes that could be operative as we approach a text. So these 3 attitudes are the cynical attitude, the sympathetic attitude, and the fanatical attitude. So the sympathetic attitude, needless to say, is that middle point. It has a quality that is desirable, that is productive, that gets us somewhere. It's a right relationship with it, presumably, to be sympathetic. And the 2 extreme points, the 2 dangerous attitudes that are not productive, that blind us in different ways about the text itself, are the cynical attitude and the fanatical attitude. So let me begin by talking about the sympathetic attitude, and eventually I'll get to the fanatical attitude and what makes it distinct. Because I'm not very clear about this topic, I want to pin it down for myself. I want to pinpoint it using several different analogies. And the first analogy is, I imagine that there's a very valuable piece of art, a painting, that I need to move from one location to another location for some reason. Maybe we want to paint the walls and we have to remove the painting from the wall and put it somewhere else for a while and then put it back in its original location. So this movement, handling this work of art, has to be done with care. I think it is applicable to use the word sympathy here. The way I touch this work of art, the way I move it, the way I put it somewhere else, there is sympathy involved in it, in the way I handle it. I don't want it to be hurt, and I don't want it to change in ways that are not part of it. I don't want any accidents. I don't want it to acquire any new accidental qualities because of my handling it, because of its movement. Another analogy is the analogy of when somebody, a co-author or a colleague, or just somebody who wants you to take a look at their document, a piece of writing. I've always been uncomfortable when people send me a link to their Google document. This is just my own personal preference. I get very nervous and I don't spend much time with the Google document. What I do instead is I download it, preferably in PDF form. So I cannot change it in any way, even though it might be useful for the person who has asked me. It might be useful for me to go through it, go through all the topographical errors and edit, actually change some of the words and make suggestions. But I'd rather not do that unless it is an explicit part of our communication, part of our contract, our exchange. I'd rather not do that because I don't want any accidents to happen. Again, I don't want to change it unintentionally. And for that, in that attitude, I feel that there is sympathy in it. Just like the way I handle a piece of art in my relocation of it. I don't want it to get damaged in the same way. I don't want to deal at all, even if possible, with the Google documents. Instead, I want to make a copy of it and do my work with the copy. Another analogy is when I was studying classical music, when I was performing a piece of classical guitar, I realized that my teachers had to really hammer this point home for me, that it's not about how I feel about a piece of art, especially when a piece of art has acquired historically its own distinct characteristics. For example, in the beginning stages of my studying classical guitar, I used to play Baroque music, Bach music, or Scarlatti. Let's Google his name, Domenico Scarlatti. I used to, according to my teachers, I used to play them in a romantic way. I used to linger on the notes. I used to change the tempo, be very flexible with the tempo of the song. And it was very satisfying for me, but I learned from my teachers that when I am playing certain pieces of music that have the already established character, the first thing I should learn to do before I do my own thing, I should learn to first find the character of the piece of music itself. I have to first search for and find what the piece itself is, and in a way get out of its way, just like in my handling of the piece of art. I have to get out of its way, let it speak in its own way, as much as possible, get out of its way. And then if I want to add my own flourishes and my own interpretation. And it took me a long time to actually be able to enjoy doing that, because at first I thought it's like being mechanical, being like a performing device. But then I started to appreciate that there's that searching element. There's a part of being an artist, a performing artist, is to find something, to find the balance in getting out of the way. You actually participate in it. That metaphor of getting out of the way, in some ways, it is not very accurate. Other analogies, following the same logic, childcare, parenting. In some ways, a parent also gets out of the way in order for the personhood of the child to arise. Being a teacher, also similar. You handle students with care, similar to the movements of the piece of art. And my final analogy is about my YouTube videos that are about a chapter, an article, or a book. I try my best to do this, to handle the text sympathetically, to not put too much of myself into the book, and not completely remove myself, and not completely remove the appreciation or the fact, the importance, the acknowledgement that this is a new medium, that I'm bringing, I am moving something into something else. I'm moving a piece of text that doesn't belong in this medium. It was not intended to be expressed in this medium. And in that movement, I have to apply some sympathy in order for that piece of work to speak, to continue to speak, to do something, to have some kind of effect in this medium. Okay, so that's some thoughts about sympathy. Now I was reminded of Jordan Peterson, 12 rules, and specifically the rule that sounds similar to these discussions, to the present discussion, our discussion on sympathy. He has a rule that sounds resonant to this, and that is, of course, rule number 9, which says, assume the person you're listening to knows something you don't know. Sounds good, sounds sympathetic, sounds like you're letting the other person speak. But as many critics have pointed out, this is on the surface sympathetic, and it has a quality that actually makes it ultimately a fanatical rule. Why? Because as many people have pointed out, when you put all the rules together and the way they are expanded, and you put them in, provide a context, putting all those pieces together, you realize that Peterson's approach with the 12 rules is an extremely solipsistic approach to life. Solipsistic in the way that the person himself or herself is at the center of the universe. And every single one of these rules is in some ways related to this self, related to this you. You are supposed to gain the optimal amount of benefit from the world. This is, when we read it in that context, in that solipsistic undertone, when we bring it out, when we realize that it is ultimately a self-serving rule, and then we read it again, it becomes more apparent. That assumes the person you're listening to knows something you don't know, because you want to acquire that. You want to extract that from this person. So momentarily suspend judgment until you get this piece of information out of this. So this is very useful. Peterson's rule number 9 is very useful because it misses the mark of sympathy in a very interesting way that at the same time helps us realize what fanaticism is. How we deviate from sympathy in a way that makes us fanatics, that possibility. So fanaticism is when we are inflexible, when we have a very special kind of inflexibility. So my first assumption, my first premise is that being fanatic is a kind of flexibility, and we can divide flexibility very broadly into 2 general categories. There are 2 ways to be flexible. We can be flexible about the means of pursuing our goals, or we can be fanatic about our goals, what we are pursuing. We can be fanatical about superordinate goals, superordinate purposes, and we can be fanatical about, or inflexible about, subordinate goals, or the means by which we pursue our goals. In other words, we can be fanatical about how we do things, or why we do things, or what. So the more we go towards why, the more we are inflexible about the why of our activities. In my view, we are moving towards fanaticism. In the Peterson example, when people criticize Peterson for being self-serving, solipsistic, that way of viewing Peterson as a fanatic is based on the assumption that Peterson is very inflexible about the why of pursuing his rules. We pursue the rules in a very inflexible way, in a way that is always in the service of that self, in the service of the solipsistic self, or that person at the center of the universe. In general, when we are fanatical, when we have a fanatical attitude, we have decided. It's about having decided in advance why something is done, why a work of art is there. When I'm fanatical about it, I'm not sympathetic. I'm too much. It's an excessive amount of sympathy. So much sympathy that I'm actually more sure about why the art is important, more sure than the artist, or showing it an unusual or excessive and unwarranted amount of sympathy for that piece of art. It's like when you're listening to somebody and the person themselves are not very sure, the person himself or herself is exploring some thoughts. They're not dogmatic, but you apply dogmatism into while you're listening to that person, you become more certain, you become more confident than the person to whom you're listening to. So that's, I think, in my mind, it's a very good example. It's an example that clarifies the problem with fanaticism. It doesn't allow for a piece of art, a person, a speech to be open-ended, to be ambiguous, to be explorative. So when we are fanatical, when we become fanatical, when we adopt a fanatical attitude, we deprive the object of our attention. We deprive the other side, the other person, group, piece of art, whatever. We deprive the object of our admiration from its own teleology, from the possibility that teleology might be unsettled, might be open, from the movements in its teleology, that it might have a teleology, but it might be a shifting teleology, shifting and growing and explorative teleology, not something that can be pinned down by our purpose. So to be fanatic is, in a way, to go overboard. In Persian, we have this expression, "Kasiye daghtar az ash," which says that the bowl, soup, you pour the soup into the bowl, and the bowl becomes hotter than the soup itself. That expression is meant to convey that when a follower becomes more fanatical than the leader or the prophet, which shows, again, why fanaticism, being fanatical, is problematic. All right, I hope that made some sense. Thank you very much for your attention, for your continuing support, and I wish you again a very happy Christmas.